The Lawson family portrait was taken on December 23, 1929. Everyone wore new clothes bought specially for the occasion. 2 days later, every person in that photograph except one would be dead. Germantown, North Carolina. In December 1929 was a small farming community in Stokes County, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Tobacco was the crop that sustained families through the year. The work was hard, the money tight, but the community was close-knit. Christmas meant something here. A pause in the difficult rhythm of tenant farming, a chance to gather with family, to celebrate what little prosperity the year had brought. The Lawson family had done better than most. Charlie Lawson, 43 years old, had managed to purchase his own farm on Brook Cove Road in 1927. He was no longer working someone else's land. He was a landowner now, a man of modest but real property. His wife Fannie was 37, still bearing children after nearly 2 decades of marriage. Their oldest son Arthur was 19. Their youngest, Mary Lou, was just 4 months old. On December 23rd, Charlie loaded his entire family into the wagon and drove them to Winston-Salem, the nearest city. This was unusual. Farm families didn't make such trips lightly, but Charlie had a purpose. He bought new clothes for everyone, suits for the boys, dresses for the girls, new outfits for Fannie and himself. Then he took them to a photography studio and had a formal portrait made. The photograph shows 9 people arranged carefully for the camera. The adults stand in back. The children sit in front. Everyone is dressed in their new clothes. Everyone is looking at the camera. It's a formal family portrait, the kind that would normally mark a wedding or a significant anniversary. 2 days later, it would be the only photograph ever taken of 7 of them together. And 2 days after that, it would be published in newspapers across the country to illustrate one of the most shocking crimes North Carolina had ever witnessed. Christmas morning began early at the Lawson farm. Fannie woke before dawn to tend the fire in the wood stove, stoking the coals to take the December chill off the small house. By the time the sun rose over the tobacco fields, 17-year-old Marie was already in the kitchen, mixing ingredients for a raisin cake. It was a Christmas tradition, something special for the family meal they'd share later. The house gradually filled with the sounds and smells of the holiday. The younger children, Raymond, age 2, and baby Mary Lou, were still sleeping. James, 4 years old, was awake and underfoot. 12-year-old Carrie and 7-year-old Maybell were getting dressed, excited about the day ahead. They'd been planning to walk over to their aunt and uncle's house, just a short distance through the fields. Arthur, the oldest at 19, was preparing for a rabbit hunt. Some neighbor boys had come by that morning, and they'd been doing target practice in the yard, a normal sound in rural North Carolina, where hunting was a way of life. The crack of shotgun fire echoed across the farm. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Around noon, the neighbors departed. Arthur and a friend named Sanders realized they were running low on ammunition. Charlie suggested they walk into Germantown, about 1.5 miles away, to buy more shells from the general store. Arthur agreed. He grabbed his coat and set off down the road, leaving the farm behind. He didn't know he'd never see his family alive again. What happened over the next hour would become the subject of speculation, investigation, and horror for decades to come. But the basic facts were established quickly because Charlie's nephew, Claude Lawson, was one of the first to discover what had been done. Carrie and Maybell left the house first, heading toward their aunt's place. They never arrived. Charlie was waiting by the tobacco barn. When his daughters came into view, he shot them both with his 12-gauge shotgun. To ensure they were dead, he struck them repeatedly with the weapon's stock. Then he dragged their bodies into the barn and placed rocks beneath their heads. He returned to the house. Fannie was sitting on the front porch. He shot her where she sat. She died instantly, her body slumping against the porch railing. Inside, Marie was still in the kitchen with the cake she'd been baking. Charlie shot her there. 4-year-old James was in the house. Charlie shot him. 2-year-old Raymond, barely more than a toddler, was shot as well. 4-month-old Mary Lou, the baby, was too small to shoot cleanly. Charlie bludgeoned her to death with the shotgun. And then, in an act that would puzzle investigators and family members for generations, Charlie took time to arrange the bodies. He placed pillows beneath the heads of the victims inside the house. He positioned them carefully, almost tenderly. The living room floor was soaked with blood, so much blood that witnesses later described being able to scoop it up with shovels, but the heads rested on pillows, as if Charlie wanted them to be comfortable. After killing his wife and 6 children, Charlie walked into the woods behind the farmhouse. His 2 beagle dogs followed him. In a clearing among the trees, he placed the shotgun against his chest, used a stick to reach the trigger, and shot himself through the heart. The dogs lay down beside his body and waited. When Arthur returned from town around 3 p.m., he found the farmhouse silent. Too silent. He called out. No one answered. He walked toward the house and saw his mother's body on the porch. Arthur ran for help. He reached his uncle's house and gasped out what he'd seen. Word spread through the small community within minutes. Claude Lawson, Charlie's nephew, was among the first to arrive at the farm. Whenever I went in there, some of them was laying in the house dead. Blood was running every which way, Claude would recall in an interview 60 years later. His voice still carried the shock of that afternoon. He killed them all in the house there, but 2 girls. He shot them right there at the barn and drug them into the barn and put rocks under their head. The Stokes County Sheriff arrived shortly after. There was no mystery about who had committed the murders. The only question was why. Charlie Lawson's body was found in the woods, his shotgun beside him, his dog still keeping vigil. The weapon was the same 12-gauge he'd been using for target practice that morning, the same one Arthur had walked to town to buy ammunition for. In 1929, criminal investigation was a simpler, more straightforward process than it would later become. There were no crime scene photographers on staff, no forensic teams to process evidence. The local doctor, C.J. Helsebeck, was called to examine the bodies and determine cause of death. That part was obvious: gunshot wounds and blunt force trauma. But Dr. Helsebeck had seen Charlie professionally in the months before Christmas, and he provided crucial information to investigators. Charlie had been complaining of severe headaches and insomnia for several months. He'd seemed troubled, not quite himself. Some neighbors reported he'd been behaving erratically, nothing alarming enough to cause serious concern, but enough to be noticed. He'd been short-tempered. He'd been withdrawn. The portrait expedition to Winston-Salem suddenly took on new significance. Why had Charlie spent money the family couldn't afford on new clothes and a formal photograph just days before Christmas? Why had he seemed so insistent that everyone be dressed nicely, that the portrait be perfect? Dr. Helsebeck had another idea. He wanted to examine Charlie's brain. Head injuries were known to cause personality changes, violent behavior, unpredictable actions. If Charlie had suffered some kind of trauma to his skull, perhaps while working on the farm, perhaps in an accident no one knew about, it might explain the inexplicable Dr. Helsebeck contacted Dr. Fred Taylor at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, one of the premier medical institutions in the country. Together, they performed an autopsy on Charlie Lawson that night, removing his brain and preserving it in formaldehyde for more detailed analysis. The initial findings were inconclusive. Charlie's brain appeared relatively small, and a portion of the center seemed underdeveloped. But there was no obvious injury, no clear trauma that would explain why a tobacco farmer with no history of violence had suddenly murdered his entire family on Christmas Day. Dr. Taylor took the brain back to Johns Hopkins for further examination. The results of that analysis were never definitively published. The brain itself eventually disappeared, its location unknown, lost somewhere in the nearly century that followed. but the autopsy had revealed nothing dramatic enough to explain what Charlie had done. The community was left with questions that had no answers. Inside the house, investigators found a blood-stained Christmas poem on the floor. Most of the words were illegible, soaked through with blood, but the phrase Santa Claus was still visible. Marie's cake sat on the kitchen counter, never served, a monument to the celebration that would never happen. Arthur, the sole survivor, was 19 years old and suddenly alone. He'd been spared only because his father had sent him away to buy ammunition, the very ammunition that would be used to kill his family. The psychological weight of that coincidence would burden him for the rest of his life. On December 27, 1929, just 2 days after the murders, 7 caskets were loaded onto hearses on Murphy Street in Winston-Salem. The Yelton funeral parlor had worked through the night to prepare the bodies. It was decided that the family would be buried together in a mass grave at Browder Cemetery near Germantown, in a plot donated by a local landowner. What happened next demonstrated both the genuine grief of a small community and the darker side of human curiosity. 5,000 people attended the funeral. 5,000. In a county where the entire population was measured in thousands, this represented a staggering turnout. Photographs from that day show crowds packed so tightly around the cemetery that people climbed into trees to get a better view. Not all of those 5,000 were mourners. Many were simply curious, drawn by newspaper accounts that had spread the story across North Carolina and beyond. The murders had made the front page of the New York Times. A family annihilation on Christmas Day in a small rural community by a father who seemed to have no motive. It was sensational news by any standard. The 7 caskets were lowered into a single grave. Fannie held baby Mary Lou in her arms, mother and infant buried together. A minister read verses about peace and reunion in heaven. Arthur stood at the graveside, supported by relatives, the only member of his immediate family still alive. Almost immediately, the Lawson farm became a tourist attraction. Charlie's brother Marion opened the house for tours, charging admission to see the death scene. The blood-stained floors, the rooms where the murders had taken place, Marie's cake still sitting in the kitchen, all of it was preserved and displayed. Visitors took souvenirs. They picked raisins off the cake until it had to be placed in a glass case for protection. Some even collected the blood-soaked earth from outside the tobacco barn. This wasn't unusual behavior for the era. Dark tourism, visiting sites of tragedy and death, had a long history in America. Public executions drew crowds. Disaster sites became destinations. The Lawson farm was simply the latest in a tradition of commercializing tragedy. But for those who had known the family, who had been neighbors and friends, the tourism felt ghoulish. The Lawson children had been real kids who played in those fields, who attended the local church, who had been part of the community's fabric. Now strangers were paying to gawk at where they'd died. The why of it all remained unanswered. The head injury theory couldn't be proven. The autopsy had been inconclusive. Charlie had left no note, no explanation, no final words that might illuminate his thinking. Then, 60 years later, a new theory emerged, one that had been whispered about in the community but never publicly stated. Author Trudy Smith, researching her book about the case, received a phone call from Stella Lawson, a relative. Stella said she'd overheard family members discussing something Fannie had confided before her death. Concerns about an inappropriate relationship between Charlie and their daughter Marie. The theory was that Marie had been pregnant with her father's child, that both Charlie and Fannie knew, and that the murders were an attempt to hide the secret. This would explain the timing, why Charlie had taken the portrait, knowing it might be the last photograph of his family together. Why he'd bought them all new clothes, why he'd seemed so troubled in the months before Christmas. A friend of Marie's came forward to support this theory, saying Marie had confided the pregnancy to her shortly before Christmas, but there was no physical evidence, no autopsy of Marie that confirmed pregnancy, no documentation beyond whispered memories and second-hand accounts. Other relatives disputed the incest theory entirely. They said Charlie was a strict but loving father, that there was no evidence of abuse, that the whispers were just attempts to make sense of something that made no sense, a head injury that didn't show up on autopsy, an incestuous pregnancy that was never confirmed, mental illness with no documented symptoms. The truth is that we'll never know for certain why Charlie Lawson killed his family on Christmas Day, 1929. What we know is what happened. The when, the where, the how, all documented, all witnessed, all preserved in newspaper accounts and official records. The why remains as mysterious as it was on that December afternoon when Arthur came home to find his family dead. Arthur Lawson lived 16 more years after the murders. He married, had children, tried to build a life separate from the tragedy that had defined his existence, but the weight of being the sole survivor proved too much. According to family accounts, he would sometimes lock himself in a room with a bottle of whiskey and play the murder ballad that had been written about his family, The Murder of the Lawson Family, recorded just months after the killings and sold as sheet music across the South. In 1945, Arthur died in a car accident at age 31. Whether it was truly an accident or something more deliberate was never established. He left behind a wife and 4 children, but also left behind the burden of being the last living person who remembered Christmas morning, 1929, before everything changed. The Lawson family home stood for decades, first as a tourist attraction, then as a slowly deteriorating reminder. Eventually, it was demolished. The mass grave at Browder Cemetery remains, marked by a headstone listing all 7 victims. Visitors still come, drawn by the story, by the unanswered questions, by the sheer horror of what happened there. The case influenced how rural communities thought about family violence, about the hidden dynamics that could exist behind closed doors, about the impossibility of ever truly knowing what happened in someone else's home. In 1929, domestic violence wasn't discussed openly. Child abuse wasn't investigated systematically. The idea that a father could be sexually abusing his daughter was almost unthinkable in polite conversation. The Lawson murders forced those conversations, however uncomfortable. If the incest theory was true, and we may never know, then the murders represented not just a Christmas tragedy, but the violent culmination of ongoing abuse. If the head injury theory was true, then they represented how little was understood about brain trauma and its effects on behavior. Or perhaps there was no theory that fully explains it. Perhaps Charlie Lawson simply broke under pressures we can't reconstruct from the distance of 95 years. Perhaps there were financial worries, marital problems, psychological burdens that accumulated until something snapped on Christmas morning. 1929. The family portrait remains the most haunting artifact. 9 people posed carefully for the camera, dressed in their finest clothes, looking ahead to some future that Charlie must have known wouldn't come. That photograph wasn't just evidence. It was a farewell, a final record of a family that would cease to exist 48 hours later. The Lawson family, Fannie, Marie, Carrie, Maybell, James, Raymond, and baby Mary Lou, were more than victims. Their tragedy led to conversations about family violence that might not have happened otherwise. Their story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that darkness can exist in the most ordinary places, that Christmas Day isn't immune to horror. Sometimes there are no satisfying answers. Sometimes we're left with blood on the floor, a cake never eaten, a portrait that captured a family that no longer exists. The investigation did what investigations in 1929 could do. The community grieved as communities do. And the mystery remains because Charlie Lawson took the truth with him into those woods. So here's what haunts me about this case. Do you think the head injury really changed Charlie that much? Or was it something deeper that we'll never fully understand? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I actually read them, and this case has generated theories for 95 years. This is part of the Christmas series, looking at how the season we celebrate can harbor the darkest moments. If you're into this kind of storytelling, the full story plus the investigation work, subscribe for more.